Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Preserving History and Democracy podcast. My name is Caroline Zamora. I'm the Chief Deputy County Clerk. We have a really exciting episode for you today. But first, I want to go ahead and send a shout out to our amazing team. Cindy, our communications coordinator, is not joining us today. Also, Jacob Slaughter, who is our producer extraordinaire behind camera and makes all of this happen. Bernadine Caporal, who's joining me today, also a producer of ours. And I'm going to turn it over to Bern so that she can introduce our guest.
Thanks, Caroline. Hi, I'm Bern, and today we have a very special guest. We have with us to talk about the topic of great historical significance from ranches to rockets. Please welcome Mr. Jim Eckles, author and historian. Welcome to our podcast.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Can I just say, Bern, you've done a great job this year, you and Cynthia. Like, we've had some dang good episodes this year, and I'm excited for this one. This one's really cool.
This one is cool.
Yes.
Well, it does hit home. I mean, this is current history because there are people alive that have lived through this history and are very familiar with it. And that's how I learned a lot of this, is talking to ranchers and then working at the missile range. So
primary sources.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the questions you wanted to know was how I got interested in this. Well, I came to the missile range in 1977, a long time ago at this point, and I found out that I didn't know much. And so the missile range is 3,200 square miles. You know, that's as big as Delaware and Rhode Island put together. It's a big piece of real estate. And I had, as in public affairs, my job was to be the interface between the public, the news media, and the Army in White Sands. And so I had to learn about the missile range, how it works and all that stuff, the history of the missile range, the V-2 rockets and whatnot. But people are also interested in the ranches, the history before the missile range, the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And I had to learn that. And then there were ranchers that wanted to go back and see their old places. And so I was escorting them out. So I had to know and learn all this stuff. It took a decade or two to really get a good handle on it. And so people started telling me, you know, you ought to write a book about what you did. And so I produced Pocket Full of Rockets, which is kind of a history of the range.
Yeah. Love that title.
And I purposely, in the first few chapters, talk about the prehistory. Talk about the Mogollon, the Indians that were out there before the Spanish came in, before the Texans came in and put ranches out there and whatnot, and how that all changed in the World War II. And we switched from an agricultural economy out there to a high-tech missile technology kind of a thing. So it's an interesting transition. I want to talk about that.
Okay, great.
And one of the things I want to talk about first is how do you ranch in a desert? You know, this is desert. I mean, it really is dry. My rain gauge, I live in the southeast part of town, since the 1st of January 2024, I'm still under 5 inches of moisture.
Wow.
That's 16 months of almost nothing. So ranching in this desert is a tough proposition. And I want to talk about what's required to do that, because I think a lot of people have seen movies and TV shows and they picture cows out there in the prairies and when there's grass and whatnot. Well, that's not so much here.
Not quite.
No. And so, in fact, after the Mexican-American War, the president sent William Tecumseh Sherman, the Civil War general. He was still a young officer. Sent him to the Southwest to figure out what the United States had gotten from Mexico. And when Sherman got back to Washington, he met with the president, and he told the president, I think we're going to have to make him take the place back. And he couldn't figure out why, and he said it was just an awful place to be. So I ran into a rancher that had a similar kind of explanation once. I took a family to their place. It was an older gentleman who wanted to show his grandkids where he had spent his youth at the early part of the 20th century. And the walls of the old adobe house were still there, and he was telling the kids what it was like, how they put gauze up in the ceiling to keep the scorpions from falling down on him. And that as a kid, his job was to go out if it rains and scoop water off puddles, put it into a bucket, and then dump it into their cistern. The silt would settle out, and they'd have pretty good water because the well water was so salty they couldn't drink it. And so he's telling the kids this, and I'm standing beside him, and this is out in an area in the flats. There's not a tree in sight. You can see for 10 miles in any direction. There's not a single tree out there, just creosote, mesquite, and yuccas. And he turns to me and he says, you know, the best decision my dad ever made, 1920, was to leave here.
Wow.
I thought, well, okay, that says a lot.
Yeah.
But not everybody had that same kind of experience. So ranching in the desert requires water. I mean, you got to have water. And since there's not much of it, you need lots of land. I mean, most of that land out there has got mesquite, creosote bushes on it. The grass, which cattle need, is in between the bushes. There are places where there's more grass. So it turns out that to have a ranch in our part of the country requires square miles of land. Some of these ranches had 20 square miles associated with them, just so there was enough grass that they could raise a couple of hundred head of cattle and make it economically feasible to have some income selling those cows once or twice a year and whatnot. And to do that, of course, 20 square miles of land is a lot of land. And unless you're Ted Turner, like in the Armendariz place, or somebody else, you can't afford that. So what the typical strategy in our country is for the rancher to own, patent a small block of land, and then lease from the state and federal governments the land around it to run cows, sheep, goats on. And so that's what happened. And most of the ranches out in the Missile Range are constructed that way. For instance, the Missile Range has 2.2 million acres on it. Right?
Wow. I didn't know it was that.
It's that big. Only 72,000 acres of that was privately owned. The rest was federal and state lands that those ranchers leased the grazing rights to. And so a rancher might own a quarter of a section or a whole section of land. That's a square mile, 640 acres. That entitled them the rights to then lease to run their cattle or goats or sheep. And the government, since they owned the land, had specialists that would go out and they would determine what they called the carrying capacity of that land. Some land had lots of grass and had a higher carrying capacity, more cows per square mile. Some had mostly brush on it or just salt flats, so very low carrying capacity. And so every plot of land had a different carrying capacity. So out here in our country, the carrying capacity in some of that land was under 10 cows per square mile. Some was a little higher, maybe 11, 12 cows. And then they paid the lease based on that. So that's why it required so much land to actually do a ranch. And one of the things that most people don't realize is that, you know, everybody knows about cattle ranching. We've all seen the movies, we've all seen the TV shows. The San Andres Mountains out here and some of the Oregons were filled with goats in the 1920s, 30s until the Second World War, Angora goats. And there were thousands, probably tens of thousands of goats in those mountains at one point. And the wool, they didn't call it wool, they called it mohair. They were sheared, and that was very fine wool. It wasn't your normal sheep's wool. And it was used for clothing, blankets, uniforms, upholstery in cars and on furniture. It was pretty valuable stuff. And so we have two different kinds of ranches out on eastern Doña Ana County in the San Andres and in the flats over there on what's now the Missile Range going on. So that's kind of the basis for ranching, and the water all makes it possible. So you got to have rain for the grass. What happens when it doesn't rain and you've got a ranch out there? Rob Cox, the grandson of W.W. Cox, when I came to work at White Sands, he owned the Cox Ranch out there. He'd come down to my office, and he'd come and sit at my desk, and we'd talk about the old time days, what it was like running a ranch. And he said to me, it was just kind of crazy to try to be a rancher in the desert here. And we talked about what happens when it doesn't rain because there's no grass. Well, all of a sudden, you might have water coming out of the ground, like the Cox Ranch sits on a break in that alluvial fan on the east side, and that dropped 30 feet only 10,000 years ago. But that interrupted the flow of underground water, and so there are springs right there, St. Augustine Springs. They anglicized that, whereas the pass is San Augustine, the Spanish version. So anyway, they always had surface water. So the cows always had plenty of water to drink. But if there's no grass, there's nothing for them to eat. So a rancher is faced with three options. One is to bring in feed for the cows, and of course that hits the bottom line for the ranch. That's expenses that you don't need. Another possibility is to move your cattle someplace else where there is grass, maybe up in the Sacramento Mountains or maybe in the northern part of the state. But then you got to lease that land, you got to pay for transportation and whatnot. Another possibility is to sell your animals. And that's a problem. If everybody's doing that, that huge number of animals goes on the market, the prices sink. And so those aren't good options for ranchers. So rain is really, really important. So let's talk a little bit about ranches that were out there. And I've been to most of them on the Missile Range and met many of the people that ranched. And I would say for our standards, how we live today, and back in those days too, for people in town, in the cities, ranching was pretty primitive living. We're talking about homes built of either adobe, some were stone up in the mountains because it's readily available, and also board and batten, a frame house with boards and batten. And these people often built their own homes, and they got to be very creative and inventive. You'll go and see some of the old homes where board and batten, and you'll see where a knot hole's been knocked out of the board, opening it up to the weather, right? Well, they'll have cut out a little piece of a tin can and nailed it over the hole. I mean, you learn to do things with tin and baling wire.
Whatever
and all
you
that.
have.
And these people were creative. So those are the kind of homes. There is one log house on the Missile Range up north in the mountains. They've actually put a shelter over it to try to preserve it. But water then becomes the basic need for all these places. And we need to talk a little bit about eastern Doña Ana County, coming off the San Andres and Oregon Mountains. Those slopes, the water underground is pretty good. You can have a well, and it's good fresh water. But as soon as you get to the bottom of the alluvial fans of these mountain ranges and you start to hit into the Tularosa Basin, there's literally a sea of water there, but it's saltier than ocean water. Wow. It is nasty, nasty stuff. That's why Alamogordo has a desalinization plant and whatnot. They've got water all over the place, but they can't use it. Right. And they have to get water out of the Sacramento Mountains to make it work.
In fact, in Alamo, I believe if you purchase a house, you have to do, I forget what it is, but it's because the water table is so high compared to like Las Cruces.
Wow.
Right.
And
yes.
so I think it's something with the foundation that you have to make sure your foundation is correct and things like that. Yeah.
And the water table at the national park, if you go in the picnic area and take a shovel with you and dig a hole a couple of feet deep, that hole will fill up with water.
Yeah.
But again, it's nasty water. You can't drink it. So anyway, ranches that were on the slopes could dig wells and had windmills and stuff and get water, and that was fine. When they got out into the flats, it became a little more difficult. The Coxes had pretty good water at their spring along that alluvial fan. When you get up to the two Lucero ranches north of that, you're getting onto an area where there might be good water, but it might be getting a little salty out there. So a lot of ranches, especially the ones in the flats, resorted to trying to collect rainwater and snow melt. The roofs on the houses had gutters around them, and they usually had a metal roof, and those gutters would collect any water coming off the roof and send it into a cistern. And like the gentleman I was talking about earlier up in the north part of the range, where he's scooping water off the surface to try to collect fresh water and get the sediments to settle out of it. Water was very, very precious, and so it was something to be treasured. One of the families, the Bennetts, up in Bosque Canyon on the Missile Range, I took the daughters in to see the place once. And they were telling me about their mother was so proud that she had running water in her house. It was unheard of. Everybody was hauling a bucket at a time and stuff. And the house was a one-room adobe structure. That one room was the kitchen, living room, den, dining room, bedroom, everything. And they had 2 or 3 kids. And so, but Mr. Bennett was clever. He had a windmill up above the house. And this was a goat operation, and they pumped water and they put it in a big holding tank, so they'd always have water for their thousands of goats. But he also ran a pipeline then from the holding tank, and he ran it and he just drilled a hole through his adobe wall, and he hung a sink on the wall with the pipe coming out, and the water would come down, gravity feed to that pipe, and run into the sink, and they'd put a cork in it. So anytime she wanted water, she'd pull the cork out, and water would run into her sink, plug it up, and then the drain went back outside. So Mrs. Bennett had running water.
Living the life.
Right.
Living the life. Man, that is so interesting. My gosh. The gentleman we spoke to earlier this year? Dale Owens.
Dale
Yes,
Owens.
the Love Ranch, right?
Yes.
The Love Ranch.
I've met him, and I've been out there once or twice, yes. And it's a little more developed because it was taken a little later in the government takeover of lands and stuff. They didn't lose that until after the Second World War. Other people lost their ranches during the war. And the food that these people ate, I mean, you'd think that ranchers would have food, right? They've got livestock. Well, if you're a cattle rancher, you can't slaughter a beef, and that's profit. That's your income. Unless you're doing it cooperatively with the families and other people around you share that. Because one of the big problems is how do you store it? Because these people, none of these people had hardwired electricity.
Yeah.
Some of them had wind generators, and they would have batteries, and they could do electric lights inside the house or something like that. Hal Cox, one of the sons of W.W. Cox, had a place north of Highway 70, just down from the pass. He created kind of a dude ranch there. And people could come in. He had motel rooms there. And his wife, Alice Lee, was telling me that she had to cook for all his people. She was just, He put in enough generating power, his wind generator and batteries, so that not only did they have lights and stuff, that she had a little freezer.
Oh.
And instead of baking pies every morning for the hands, the family, and the guests, she could freeze them, so she didn't have to bake every day, bread and stuff like that. And so that was a big relief to her. So people resorted to all kinds of strategies to store food, just to keep leftovers.
Everything is so difficult.
I mean, when it's 105 degrees outside, how do you store stuff?
Right.
So if you go to these cisterns, these concrete cisterns set in the ground on many of these ranches, and you look into them, you'll often see wire hanging down. And what they would do is put meat or something into a gunny sack and hang it on the wire just above the surface of the water to try to keep it cool. Yeah. Another strategy, if
it's like a cave, it's going to stay, 60 degrees?
A little cool,
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And another strategy that families that didn't have that told me that if they had, like in the goat ranch, for instance, you had a little goat left over from a meal, you would wrap it up in wax paper and then put it in a gunny sack and then wrap your best insulating cover and then put it in the under the bed in the middle of the room, in the middle of the house, because it'd be the coolest place.
Wow.
And you'd try to retain the temperature of the meat overnight and into the next day so it wouldn't spoil. So, and then you went into town to buy your flour and all that stuff. And ranchers tell me they'd go into town once a month maybe, come back with truckload of stuff that they'd have to store. So it's an interesting and I would say primitive life. Education.
And this was the early of the 1900s.
All the way up to
Yeah.
1940.
Yeah.
Really.
Wow.
And education was a big deal. The Coxes, WW, hired a tutor to teach his kids. They had a classroom set up in the house. Other families elected to have the mother or wife live in town during the school year, and they had a house. And she would take care of the kids, and they'd go to school in Alamogordo, Las Cruces, or wherever. The Hardens up north, Emma Harden said that her parents sent her to Loretto Academy here in Las Cruces.
Wow.
And she boarded at the academy and then go back in the summer and spend her summers at the ranch. There was, up in the northern part of the range, an actual school built on the Missile Range that was paid for by Socorro, the Socorro Public Schools, hired a teacher, and all these families then had their kids in that area congregate at the school on a daily basis. So again, kind of primitive, and you never knew what you were going to get, and kids were expected, of course, to work on the ranches
Right.
as well. I ran into people that a 10-year-old would be expected to go out and take care of cows, make sure the windmill was operating, or run goats from pasture to pasture on the mountains, kind of by themselves. Given a 22 and maybe a dog to go with them, a 10-year-old.
Wow.
Imagine that in today's world. It isn't
No,
happening.
yeah. No.
It's not going to happen. No way.
I can't get a 10-year-old to clean their room.
So these ranches, all that changed in World War II. It's just overnight
What was the reason for the biggest change, I guess? The biggest reason for the change?
was the war.
Okay.
And so at the beginning of the war, before we entered it,
Okay.
the government and the military were looking for ways to assist our allies, like the Brits. And they knew that the Southwest was probably a pretty good place to do a bombing range to train pilots and bombing crews and stuff like that. And so they were already looking at the Tularosa Basin in 1940, early 41, somewhere in there. And that all changed, of course, when Pearl Harbor happens and we enter the war. And the plans to maybe let the Brits use that goes away because we're going to need it. And so the Alamogordo bombing range gets formed in early 1942. Okay? And the Department of Defense declares it an emergency, that we need that property. The Corps of Engineers, which is the real estate agent for the Army, goes out and they've done surveys, and they go to the ranchers and they say, you need to evacuate. We're going to lease your land for the duration of the war. You'll get paid, but you need to get out. And the way they did this was not very good because there was a lot of urgency in that because of what was going on. And so some of the ranchers talk about being given 2 weeks
Wow.
to get out.
What do you do with your cattle?
Right. How do you get rid of your livestock? If you're in the mountains and you've got 4,000 goats, how are you going to move them someplace else? Or a couple hundred cows. And so ranchers were faced with those same difficult scenarios as if you don't have grass. You got to move them, you got to sell them. And so, and then find a place for yourself to live. And the government didn't handle it very well. They did not give them any upfront money because this was an emergency, a national emergency. And they just told them to get out. They didn't get paid until after the first year, the lease payments for their property. And so they were taking money out of their own savings and whatnot to do that. And it left a hard feeling with a lot of the ranchers,
Sure.
the way they were treated. And the amount they got paid depended on the size of the ranch. You know, if it's a little bitty ranch, you're not going to get paid much. But if you own 1 million acres or control a lot of acreage, you'll get a lot more money. So the leases varied depending on that. And the Alamogordo bombing range was, of course, there to train bombing crews for B-17s, B-24s, and eventually B-29s. The B-29, of course, is what dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. So that went on all during the war, and fate intervened to mess up the ranchers, because this new technology that was emerging in the Second World War, the Second World War just changed the world in every way possible. And one of those ways was technologies. We got plastics out of it, we got jets, and we got radar, we got all kinds of stuff came out of
When
those.
you look back at World War I and compare it to World War II, it's not that much of a time span.
Yeah.
But immense changes.
Right. I mean, it changed the country, the attitudes and stuff, because in World War II, we've got minorities suddenly put in charge of fighting units and stuff. They're given responsible positions. Well, they come back from the war and, they've been shot at by the Japanese or the Nazis or whatever and bombed and everything else. They're not quite as submissive as they were in the old days, and they start fighting for equal rights.
Right.
And so our equal rights movement probably is led by many of these veterans and their experiences in the Second World War. Anyway, the technology that's coming out, especially this rocket technology, the V2, the German V2, the Vengeance weapon, it's the Brits have experienced it. The Germans fired V2 rockets from France and Belgium into Britain, trying to terrify the British people, get them to submit, to surrender and all that. And it didn't work. But it was a new technology, and military folks realized that it was going to be something special in the future, a new way to do war.
All right, folks. Well, we are breaking this episode up into two parts. You just heard all about the ranches. Be sure to check back next week for our part 2, and we're going to be talking about rockets, because of course ranches to rockets. So be sure to check us out next week. Thank you for listening.